Sorry. Yes. Yes.
All right, we're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. It's 5 o'clock. Roll call. Looks like we have everyone present except James Einoff, unless he's online.
No.
All right, we'll kick off with the approval of minutes. You all should have had that in your packet. So moved. Motion?
Yes, I guess.
Or motion and second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, next up, we've got public comments. We've got one signed up here in person, Jason Superior.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming out tonight. Many of you, I think, know me. My name is Jason Superior. I'm a trustee of the town Superior, and I was a liaison for the CNR while it was in existence. I've been working with the flight school to try to mitigate the noise over the towns. Just a couple questions. The number one thing is the unleaded fuel issue. When is that coming? When is that going to go into fruition? Last year you guys made a really big song and dance on it. You had the truck out there, you had the media, you had all the politicians mugging for the cameras, and my residents are wondering what's going on. Where is it? It's a big promise made by the airport. Previous airport director, I realize that. We'd like to see some progress on that. We'd like to see this actually start moving. So anything you can do to get that moving would be fantastic. I created a voluntary nighttime patterns over Highway 36 using 30 left or 30 right, so we get the plane off of 30 left. Those need improvement, and I do need the help of the airport. And I realize there's litigation going on, but one pilot went out, and then I've noticed a cyclical number. The patterns will go up and they'll drop, and the number of pilots using the patterns will go up and they'll drop. And I went to ATP after one flight went erroneously in the wrong direction, and I just said, "Look what's going on." And they changed flight instructors, and the flight instructors did not notify the new flight instructors that there was a voluntary nighttime pattern, and this is something that the new flight instructors should be using. So, given that the airport has adopted this as part of the Fly Quiet program, I would greatly appreciate if the airport would start taking a little bit of responsibility in ensuring that flight schools understand that this is part of the Fly Quiet program. Because I feel like I'm kind of on an island on my own out here trying to do this, and I'm not getting a whole lot of pushback. I'm getting a lot of pushback in the community. I'm not getting a whole lot of help. So anything you guys can do on your end would be greatly appreciated by my communities and the surrounding communities. What are we doing with the voluntary nighttime pattern going forward? I am working with the flight schools pretty much on a grassroots campaign. It's like I have to go to each individual flight school separately. I did come up with an idea that if we can modify the nighttime pattern into the morning hours on Saturday and Sunday morning, what I've noticed historically, we don't see a lot of jet traffic on Saturday and Sunday morning. And if we can have the pilot stay on 30 right for as long as it takes, maybe up to 7 o'clock, maybe up to 8 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday mornings, that's going to give the residents 1 hour, 2 extra hours to sleep on the weekend. And I know when people have little kids, that weekend hour or two for more for sleep is golden for them. So I realize that the CNR closing, getting to air traffic control is much more difficult, but I think that's a conversation that we can have. It seems like the flight schools are on board with this, so I think this would be a good modification going forward that we can actually decrease the noise both communities. Flight ceiling is another thing, and I know the FAA has got this airport at 800-foot flight ceiling, and we're the only airport in the region at 800 feet. I'd like to see what we can do to get that up to 1,000 feet. As you're aware, for every 100 feet away from an object, a noise-making implement is, it's 6 decibels quieter. So if we can gain 200 more feet in elevation, that's 12 decibels quieter. And if our decibel meters are reading the low 70s, we could be at the high 50s with this. So there's something that I think obviously is a federal level issue, which kind of brings us into my next question. Or my next subject is I will be going to DC at the end of November, and I'm going to try to reach out to Representative Hughes and Representative Patterson again, as well as trying to speak with officials at the FAA to see what we can do to get that 800 feet up to 1,000 feet, because I think that's going to be a really big game changer as far as the noise goes. And last but not least, is that my time?
It is.
30 seconds. Yeah. Mr. Dahl, I know there's litigation going on, and you and I have talked briefly, and I introduced myself and I congratulated on the position. And I know you come from a place where you do want to get involved and you want to help, you want to reach out, but yeah, there's litigation. So you and I can't talk, right? We can't have a conversation. Here's what I'd like to suggest, and I don't want you to answer it. I'm not putting you on the spot. Let's say you and I, just man to man, no phones, no notebooks, no laptops, sit down with a conversation. And I realize the attorneys will have to be present because that's kind of what we have to do. And we can talk and we can try to talk about ways we can mitigate the noise over our community and allow our communities. And if the If the lawyers have a problem, they can yell objection or whatever they do in those courtroom dramas or on suits or whatever it being, but I think you're a reasonable man. I'm a reasonable person, and I think we can do it without the boards, without the politicians, without the extraneous things. Just you and me hashing out what we can do to try to mitigate the noise. And I'll leave it at that, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Jason. Before I go online, comments in here? All right, online comments.
Right, Randy Johnson, you're unmuted.
Hey there, you with us? All right, can you hear us? We cannot hear you if you can hear us. Randy, maybe text in if you can hear us.
Yeah, you can chat back the host if you're attempting to, but I know you've done this before.
All right. We're gonna keep moving along. If we get Randy back, we'll let him talk. Were there any others online?
That's it.
Okay, all right, we're gonna close the public comment section. And Randy, if you can hear me and you get where we can get you, we're happy to open that back up and chat with you. All right, first item on the business items, board engagement and upcoming topics.
Okay, so I guess we'll talk to a couple of things today about what I'm gonna call active advice, and we'll kind of get it going. This is the button.
Yep, good.
All right. Maybe
I think you have to.
if I hit the actual button, does
Yeah.
that help? Okay. So as part of the advisory board, one of the important things for us and for us working together is that you feel comfortable making advice, that you feel that it's your place to talk about things that you're interested in, things that you have experience with, and things that you're educated about. What I want you to do is I want you to feel comfortable sharing what knowledge you have at any given time. And as we do presentations and you have questions about a topic we're talking about, feel free to ask or provide input about things you might have to talk about. So don't hesitate to offer constructive advice. If we're talking about a project, we're talking about something happening at the airport and you have an interest in that, feel free to do that. You're not supposed to just sit there and be quiet and listen to me yammer about what's on the slide. You should feel comfortable saying what it is, provide advice. We can, and if the airport doesn't necessarily agree with your advice, we can certainly provide reasons why, but your input really is essential to the airport success. And there's a wide range of topics that if you're interested in, we can have that discussion. We can bring those to airport advisory boards, or we can inject those into topics as we go. Some of that being safety and security, airport infrastructure improvements, sustainability and environment, economic development, community engagement, and the list really does go on. We're going to go in the Part 150 study. Unleaded was brought up earlier, and we'll talk about those during the projects today. But I think it's important that if you have questions and you want to know kind of where we are on things, that you should talk about those things or ask. During those presentations, I do want you to feel encouraged to ask questions. I want you to ask Ben and I questions about what's happening. And if we don't know the immediate answer, we can follow up with you later as we need or in a future meeting in order to ensure that public comment or the public can hear that response. If you have an idea or a process improvement that you want to talk about to the board, please talk to the board chair about including that in a possible future airport board meeting. Well, I'm going to talk about kind of tentatively what the airport board looks like going forward, but I want to make sure that you understand that we're going to provide updates on projects and we're going to need your input on what maybe some topics for the future that we can talk about. So today, you see project updates. We're going to go through the capital improvement plan. And we're talking about kind of like soliciting your advice, making sure that you're active participants in the process. And then we'll talk about the Southwest Development Area later. In November, we're going to talk about more project updates. We'll talk about Part 150 study, and we'll start having our in-depth conversations about House Bill 24-1235 and what the airport's response to that looks like, what the draft plans look like. And we'll be seeking, community input, and we'll seek your input as the airport advisory board about what that plan looks like. You may notice that we included all the slides in today's agenda packet. So you'll see as part of the agenda, the whole entire outline and the draft plan for that House bill when it comes out for November. In December, it's kind of the same. We'll follow up more with House Bill 24-1235, and we'll start talking about the community engagement plan, some of our accessibility standards for the airport website, and really talking about how we can better engage with our community and better engage with tenants at the airport. In January, we'll have more project updates. We'll talk more about the Part 150 study, and we'll have the final version of the House Bill 24-1235, which will be the update to the noise abatement plan, which includes some of the things that were mentioned earlier today. And then the final framework for the community engagement plan, which will always be something kind of a living document about how the airport engages and what kind of meetings and events we'll go to. But that really does kind of bring us to February, where we're going to be talking about our pavement maintenance plans and kind of an outline and draft conversation. We do have quite a lot of pavement at the airport, and we have to kind of figure out how we afford that, how we pay for that over time, and kind of how those things get phased. In March, we'll have more pavement maintenance plan updates, and we'll kind of start conversation about runway 321 with the study that was done for that, and we'll have more conversations about the future of that runway and what we can do as an airport for it. That kind of gets us an outline of, seeking advice, kind of gives you an outline of what the airport board meetings look like, kind of like now until March. They are tentative. If there are things you'd like to talk about on the airport that are not part of that, please feel free to talk to the chair of the board, and we can work through some of those topics and include them as we can. That brings us through that. Any questions about soliciting advice or input or anything like that? Okay, yeah, sir.
So are we gonna have, Eric, time in this meeting? Is that what I saw on the agenda to where you're soliciting advice, or you?
You are to provide advice at any time you feel like you want to.
Well, my advice on, as we looked at the next 4 or 5 months in the future, I would echo what, Jason said, is there wasn't anything about low lead fuel. And I think that I mentioned this a couple meetings ago. I think this airport ought to be at the forefront in the state in bringing low lead fuel here. And I think that we need expert testimony to the group. I would love to get George Braley here from GAMI or the guy is a machine. I'm certain would do a live Zoom call, but it wouldn't stun me. He's only in Oklahoma, so he's not that far away. So he's the GAMI 100 low lead guy. Maybe we get a representative from Swift here, and it's not like, I'm gonna echo everything Jason said, but I agree with the point that we did the dog and pony show a year ago, and that was about it. It's frustrating for us, for the GA pilots as well.
It's
I would-
not just frustrating for you.
I get it, I know, I don't think you guys are being duplicitous by any stretch. It's just, I think that, if we wait for the bureaucrats, the lovely bureaucratic machine, we're gonna be talking about this in December of 2029. I also think, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
I'm changing subjects.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead if you wanted to.
No, if you have more to talk.
I still think that, I've mentioned this with the, county commissioners, that, I think there's still an elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed. And I think that we as an airport need to take the leadership role to enhance the trust within all the stakeholders at the airport. The fact that now, and this is Jim's naivete, I get it, but the fact that 2 grown adult men can't meet without lawyers in the room just cringes at me. I realize that's reality.
Not an airport
But-
issue.
Good God, yeah. Can we do something to increase the trust within the stakeholders and among the stakeholders? Before I retired a couple of years ago, I told you this, I worked for an organization where they'd send me around the world to Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies to address trust issues. So I'm pretty well trained in that area. I did my PhD dissertation on leadership trust. I'm happy to volunteer to facilitate that. But it just gives me the creeps when a good guy like Jason and a good guy like you gotta have lawyers. I mean, if you're bringing your ex-wives into it, I get it, but you know what I mean? Come on, man. There's gotta be something we can do, because community engagement's gonna go nowhere if we don't address the trust. So that, I'm off my soapbox. Go. I hope that helps, if that's what you were looking for. If not, yeah.
Nope, that works perfect. I like it. Thank you.
I feel the same way, and I think, my career anyway, lawyers are indispensable for providing good advice. But I don't know that it should always be considered a mandate. And it's advice, that's what you pay them for, and it's usually very helpful. But I think as soon as it's taken as a mandate, don't do this, don't do that, I think it really can negatively impact communication and problem solving.
Thank you.
And I kind of agree, there's, the one thing that I've been working with, and I've been working with the other flight schools and a little bit with Jason and stuff, is the pattern altitude of 800 feet. It does not meet the criterias for all the other airports, basically in Colorado and in the nation. So we've got this unusual pattern, which, as a safety aspect, I think all the pilots in the entire metro would agree that they would rather have 1,000 foot. So I'm curious, and I don't know these answers, but how much effect do we have as far as talking to the tower? Or what can we do to present something or bring this up? I'm willing to help, with the presentation as far as what to do or what we're thinking of. I have talked to one tower person, because we have the CFI meetings, every month, and they came in and they do their presentation at our meeting, so we can see if there's any updates or anything new, like they just changed the procedures for taking off to monitor tower and things like that. So we usually get a little bit of a jump start on that, which is great, because then we can start passing it on to the students and things like that. But I asked him briefly, I said, changing the pattern from 800 to 1,000, he says he doesn't see that happening easily because of the jet traffic coming in and stuff like that. But I've talked to some of the jet guys and started doing some research, and the jet guys, they want to be up higher. They don't even want to be down at the level that they're talking. They said, we won't go down that way. He says, we're not gonna make a pattern, at 6,700 feet. They said, we won't go below 7. And then some of them have radars and things like that. It'll set off all their alerts in the airplanes. And then they'll get calls from their company because they violated their company policies. So I think there's I know the tower is kind of reluctant to try to maybe change this, but I think this is a real positive effect for safety, for noise, for just everybody wins. I don't think I think it'd be a little bit of a process, but I'm wondering what we can do as a board, how effective can we be as far as starting to present some of sort of talking to the tower people, or maybe being able to touch base with the FAA and, getting some of these things started going down the pipeline, because I think this is a really important thing, and everybody's on board that I've talked to, all the flight schools, all the instructors, it's really more of a safety issue and get the benefits of the noise. So I kind of like to look into that at some point or somehow and find out what us as a board could do to maybe help present this to the FAA and the tower.
I would imagine that the comment about going to DC and talking about things that was mentioned earlier would probably be the most beneficial part of that equation. Maybe not necessarily the goose, but senator level would be beneficial as well to talk about macroscopic metroplex issues. It's not just Rocky Mountain. It's not just Centennial. It's a metroplex that is really the topic. So from a regional perspective, you need to talk about things from the regional side. If that means addressing senators or whatever to do that, that may be what is necessary to do that. Locally, as a board, I would highly recommend you talk to the tower, talk to your pilots, make sure that you have the backing to do that. As an airport, we cannot enact that ourselves, but certainly talking to the senators and talking to the FAA would be a good start to make sure that conversation can happen. We would talk about the Part 150 later today.
Is,
And that's part of, we can do that.
would the FAA listen to our board? Or would, if we invited them, would they be interested in? You know, because right now, I've talked to the FAA and they're standing back. They're, and part of it's because of the lawsuits. They want to see how things pan out, what happens, so they're reluctant to do very much because of that. But I'm wondering if we can get somebody to listen to what we're talking about, maybe they can help guide us as far as what to do and how to do it. Do you think the FAA would, you know, listen to a presentation from the board, or do you think they would just not be willing to really listen to us? Or how much effect do we have as board members for the FAA and the tower?
I don't know the specific answer to that question. I would certainly suggest that you reach out to the tower and you talk to them directly.
Okay.
Express individually your concern and say, we've talked about this as the CFI board, talked about this as pilots. We've talked to jets. We don't think there's an issue. We're outside Class D. So it's not like we have a shelf, but we can talk about it later.
Can I ask a question, Greg, because you're a CFI? What's stopping us from doing it tomorrow as a voluntary noise abatement? I've never had the tower tell me I'm flying too high. And
Well,
I'm even looking at the airport facilities directory. I don't see traffic pattern altitude on here, other than with the flight
it's
document.
listed at 6,500 feet.
On
And
the
then-
flight, I don't see it in the AFD.
Yeah, it's listed. I've done it where I've come in at 6,700 feet, especially in a faster airplane, and they don't say anything.
Yeah,
But if you're in a slower airplane, like a 172, I've had many times requests to descend down to pattern altitude, 7,500 feet, and they'll state that. So I've seen that a lot of times.
They generally decrease altitude when coming into Class D. So they'll fly at whatever transition or what altitude they're in the airspace, but once they hit Class D, they're kind of directed to decrease the traffic pattern.
I've been flying here almost 50 years. I've never had a tower say you're too high. But maybe I've never.
Yeah, they won't say you're too high, but sometimes depending on what you're flying in at, they'll say descend down to pattern altitude.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've never had that, but
Yeah.
that makes sense.
But,
Right.
and it's a little hit and miss, it depends on the control. I've asked the controller, what if we all came in at 67? He said, well, some controllers won't care. Some controllers will tell you to send 65, so it depends on the controller.
Well, what I'll do is we can reach out to the FAA and reach out to local pilots. Maybe we can have a presentation on that topic at another agenda, and we can talk in a little bit more depth about those issues. And we'll circle back and we'll talk about it then.
Thank you.
John, I saw your hand up as well.
Well, I was just gonna, on that same line as what Greg was bringing up, just gonna make the suggestion that perhaps what the board can do is look at this as a possible change or issue, and then approach the FAA as the airport advisory board. So rather than individuals going to the controllers or the FAA saying, hey, why can't you do this? Having the airport advisory board do it. To do that, however, I think we would need to be solid on it. It can't be just like, somebody made a suggestion. Well, sounds good to me. Let's just do it. Because I think they have bigger
Yes,
ramifications
we'd have to put a
than that.
presentation together. I'm wondering how
Official.
much, will the FAA come and listen to us? Would you think that's what I'm?
Yeah, I don't know, but I guarantee you they would, the board coming to them says more than any one individual.
I agree.
So, and how much weight they would give to us, the board, who knows? But if that's something we can do, I think I think that's a worthy thing for the airport advisory board to take on.
It'd be nice to have a conversation with them too.
Sure.
Kind of an open conversation, because for example, I've often thought, delaying turnouts until pattern altitude, whatever that, if it's 6,500 right now, but delaying turnouts, I don't think would have that big of a negative impact on traffic, but it could have a huge impact on noise. And it would be interesting to hear what controllers think of that concept, whether they think it's a bad idea or whether they, whether you turn out at 6,300 feet or 6,500 feet may not make a big difference to them. But as was mentioned earlier, it can make a heck of a difference in terms of
I talked to the flight schools about this issue about a year ago, about delaying the turnout until they're over Marshall Road, I think it is, over west of Superior. And I heard from 3 of the 4 flight schools that said that, the Airman's Information Manual recommends you turn crosswind 300 feet before you, below your pattern altitude. And that DPEs coming in to do a flight examination are expecting students to perform at that level, and they're not necessarily aware that it's of a noise abatement procedure and all that, and to have something non-standard for the Airman's Information Manual, they just got a little sweaty about that. They didn't say heck no, but they just were a little nervous about that. I don't know if you'd buy that argument, Greg, or not, but yeah.
There's a lot to it, and it's really
Yeah.
tricky, and
Yeah.
we won't want to waste time on that.
I don't think it's wasted time, but I think it's time that we can spend on another agenda item
Yeah.
for at a future meeting where we can actually put together, make it more constructive presentations. We can have a more in-depth conversation about it rather than kind of ad hocing it
Yeah.
today. If that's okay, I would just proceed with the next stuff, and please feel free to add commentary as we go through it.
All right, CIP.
Okay, so every year about this time, we'll be submitting a capital improvement plan to the FAA and CDOT. And as part of that process, I'm bringing it in front of you as the board to have a look at it before it gets officially submitted, in case you have comments about the order of items, things that you would like to see added to it, or potentially things removed. So as we go through it, we'll have kind of a lot of slides. I'll kind of go through some of the highlights, and we'll go through it together. So everything here is going to be a draft project. It's not been approved by the FAA at this time. The costs are all estimates, and the actual costs will vary at the time of construction. Projects will move from year to year in order to match FAA funding, and a mix of funding sources are used between local, that would be airport funds, CDOT, FAA, or bipartisan infrastructure bill, or other funding sources as they might be available, whether it's a FEMA grant or whatever. Typically, FAA funding comes in two parts: entitlements and discretionary. And local projects that are completely locally funded may shift as the airport's finances change or as different projects change in priority. So today, in 2024, we have a number of different projects to go through, in which we have Basin 160, which we've talked about before, is stormwater discharge improvements that would be located between the two parallels. Runway 30 left for a seal coat, building upgrades, airfield maintenance, equipment, taxiway construction phase 1, and the Part 150 study, all of those things kicking off this year. In 2025, we have a number of different things with the pavement improvement project, unleaded fuel tank installation, building upgrades, Exhibit A updates, and then the big one for 2025, or one of the biggest ones in the capital improvement plan that you'll see, is the RSS slope enhancement, which deals with the slope for 1-2 left. For 2026, we have taxiway D, P, and H improvements. Taxiway A west of Alpha 3, some more building improvements, and then some vehicle equipment and whatnot. 2027, we have more taxiway D and taxiway L improvements to finish taxiway D's rehab, building upgrades, and then the airport master plan process, which starts in 2027. In 2028, we have more airfield pavement rehab and part of the pavement maintenance plan, building upgrades, and then some additional equipment for the airport with skid loaders, compressors, lifts, and a mowing deck for the mowing the airport has to complete. In 2029, additional building upgrades. We do have a lot of buildings at the airport, so we have a lot of upgrades to do with that. We have a tentative plan for a expansion of the snow removal equipment building. As you may notice, we keep a lot of our snow removal equipment outside. That's not good for the equipment. And so getting that inside is beneficial for the long-term success and longevity of those equipments. And then a truck and paint remover as just recurrent equipment replacements. 2030 additional building upgrades, and then pavement rehab. You'll see pavement rehab quite a bit. We do have quite a bit of pavement at the airport. 2031, we have PAPI upgrades for 30 left to convert to 4-box. runway 30 right rehab for the design, some building upgrades, and fleet truck painter mowing deck and pickup replacements in 2031. 2032, we have runway identifier light upgrades for 30 left, 30 right rehab for the construction, and additional miscellaneous building roofing upgrades. 2033, we do have the replacement of an airfield van, taxiway Alpha east of Alpha 3, and then building upgrades, roofing, HVAC, and light. We do have run upgrades for the runway guard lights in 2034, which is a pretty light year at the moment. 2035, taxiway K seal coat. Taxiway K, complicated thing. The taxiway K is actually taxiway O. So the taxiway gets renamed from taxiway O to taxiway K, and that will happen as part of the construction process for that taxiway. Runway 30 left rehab for the design. And then 2036, we have the runway 30 left rehab and construction. And so that brings the total for that period of the capital improvement plan to $70 million, the local share of which is $21 million. And the other funds between FAA, CDOT, and bipartisan infrastructure bills is $49 million. Of that CIP process is really composed of three main projects: the RSS slope, which was $7.7 million, additional snow removal equipment for $2.5 million, and the snow removal equipment building for about $1.2 million. That is the list of the CIP. I know I kind of went through that kind of fast. Are there any questions on the CIP as you've seen it in front of you?
Question I have, Eric, is at what point do we know what the FAA grant funding available to us would be? And some of it we're entitled to and some of it we compete for, is that correct? Or?
Yeah, so we would have entitlements as a general aviation airport, which that classification isn't changing. We would have $150,000 of entitlements every year.
Okay.
Because of JSX's operation at the airport, and because we have more than 10,000 employments, that changes our entitlement ratio to some other number, which we haven't given final numbers on. In the past, when you've crossed 10,000 employments, you get $1 million of entitlements.
Okay.
And then that is a prorated formula. The FAA hasn't provided us final numbers on what that looks like for us. It's a 2-year delay. So we do expect to get more than $150,000 of entitlements this year. We don't know that number yet, but all of the math in this assumes 150,000, just to be consistent, because that's what we know. So the entitlement numbers will change. We would expect, because of the way the FAA funds projects at general aviation airports, that extra $1 million of entitlements doesn't necessarily allow the airport to do additional work. It would be taken off the top of projects we've already kind of allocated for, and then the FAA would take that difference and probably distribute it to other airports in the region. So it helps us afford projects and it helps other airports afford their projects as well. It doesn't necessarily help us do more.
Right. Yeah,
Do you have a rough idea of the scope of those two runway rehab projects? 10 million bucks each?
They are, I believe, complete reconstructions. But they're not yet designed and they are far in the future, so I can't speak with certainty about what those are.
So how could they redo the entire runway 30 right for 10 million? And they told us that 321 was 14 million. That's not meeting the common sense test.
So runway 321, and like I said, we're gonna talk about it more in March.
Yeah,
321, there's three components to 321. One is the reconstruction of 321, the relocation of Bravo, because Bravo can't stay there. It's too close to the runway. So you have to rip Bravo out and reconstruct Bravo somewhere else, probably adjacent to the apron. So the cost of the 321 project, when it was allocated and provided to you in the study, it was the cost of the complete reconstruction for 321 and then the relocation of Bravo. Whether that's $15 million, I couldn't tell you today, but I do understand your comment.
okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Quite a long list of projects. How are we prioritizing them? Is it just based on projected maintenance needs, or is it more along for some broader goals?
So generally what happens is the state will come out and they will do a pavement condition index report on the pavement at the airport. And based on the PCI number of that pavement changes that priority for the state and the FAA. So the FAA kind of would come in and say, you know, the PCI for taxiway Delta is pretty low. Like, let's say it's in the 20s out of 100, although nothing is ever 100, but let's say it's 20 out of 100. They would say, you really do need to prioritize replacing taxiway Delta because its PCI is much lower. So what you see reflected in the CIP is kind of like a condition of where are the airport's priorities for replacement based on issues we might have, or what are the FAA's priorities based on what the PCI levels of those surfaces are. So it's kind of driven by airport's prerogative, but a lot by what the FAA sees as funding opportunities and how they might compete. So a surface might have a higher PCI number, but it's a runway. And the FAA would say, well, the runway competes higher for funding than the taxiway, even though the taxiway got a lower PCI. So the FAA would say, we get it, the taxiway is kind of maybe theoretically in a worse condition, but the FAA is really keen on doing runways right now. So they would prioritize the runway versus that taxiway. And it kind of goes back and forth depending on what the priorities are for CDOT and for the FAA at the time. Any other questions about CIP today?
Wait, I requested to time for public comment at the end. There's a lot of issues come up while hearing your presentation.
Comment on business items as they come along. Business comments are done at the beginning because if you did it afterwards, we would have already taken decisions. You don't want to talk.
We didn't have any
Yeah,
availability to speak during the presentation.
so we can talk. If you've got a comment, I'm happy to take it now, but can't come too open on that. But yeah, you can always speak when there's a vote taken. There's no votes being taken on these, but I'm happy to hear your comments now.
And the one that comes to mind during this capital improvement presentation is, it seems like every day on ATIS, we hear something's out of commission. Are all those items being fed into our capital improvement program?
So I know PAPIs have been an issue on ATIS for a while. That is certainly in the CIP. If there are other topics that you have as pilots or as users or stakeholders about the airport and things that might be out of service habitually or all the time, you should bring that to airport staff so we can properly address it like at that time or properly allocate it. So the CIP is not necessarily set in stone. They're dynamic. And so if there are things that change throughout the years, like you see 10 years of CIP here, the likelihood everything in this list gets done is pretty low. And so it's more of a wish list. So if there are things that you want included in the CIP, you should talk to Ben and I about it, and then we can implement that in as we can.
So if, it's up to Stan's point, if the ATIS says that Pappy's out of service, should we then assume that you guys already know it, the airport staff knows it, since it's being broadcast by the tower?
One would presume, yeah, we would be normally the one that would notify it out or report it to the
Yeah.
tower that it's out of service.
Okay, cool.
Another quick question. I heard rumor that 2 new positions have been established in the administration. Is there truth to that?
So the airport is looking at hiring 2 new staff to help us with the community engagement plan for both public affairs and communications, and then community engagement. They would help us do the things that the airport needs to do. Like it was mentioned earlier, go out to the community, talk to the community, have a communication plan about how the airport can engage with stakeholders, with users and members of the community, not just ad hoc, but with city leaders or HOAs or what it be, just try to figure out what that comprehensive communication plan looks like. And so those 2 positions are instrumental to ensuring that we can have a proper communication plan for the airport.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I have a quick question as well. We don't see the slides beforehand, so it's tough to make a comment on what's presented. Is there either a way to get the slides attached to the agenda beforehand so we can look that over before the meeting? Or 2, maybe an email for the whole board so we can talk to your points afterwards? Or this way we don't have to wait, another month or.
I can't speak to the second topic, but for the first one, I did make sure that for this airport agenda, all the slides were included. And then we'll do that for the foreseeable future, is that if we're gonna do a slide on the screen, we'll make sure that all the slides that are going up there are part of the agenda packet.
And you can print that?
That should be up there on our website if you open up the agenda for this this meeting, I just grabbed it off of it.
It's important for me to make sure that, you know, the airport's being transparent. We're broadcasting what is on our slides to ensure that, per your point, there is an opportunity for the community to publicly comment about the things they're seeing in the slides. So it is important. If there is an issue, I want to know, but like the goal is to ensure that for the foreseeable future, if we're talking about it at a board meeting, there's slides included with the agenda.
All right, any other board questions on that one before we move to the next? Southwest Development Area.
Okay, so Southwest Development Area. So the Southwest Development Area has a number of things, and my slides somehow in my notes got out of order, but that's to be expected with the way I assembled this thing. So the airport master plans and plan initiatives are only ever educated best guesses and never set in stone. The actual layout we'll use will be market driven and based on the highest and best use. So we're going to be talking about the Southwest Development Area. It's about 50 acres of space and how the airport can allocate that and best use it. So since 1977, the airport master plan has allocated this development site for aeronautical use. Back in 1977, they figured that the airport would need not only additional hangars in the Southwest Development side, but would somehow magically need a fourth runway too. So in 1977, employment, or not employments, but operations were pretty high. I believe 256,000 employment or operations is what the airport had back in the late 70s. And they were contemplating some pretty significant growth for the airport in that area. They already were talking about the relocation of Sims. And that is something that I believe opens at the end of this month, October 26th. Is that correct, Ben?
It was actually next Friday.
Next Friday,
Or
wow.
this Friday.
So,
Our drive is later this.
oh, okay, so you'll see relocated. So over successive master plans, the design of the Southwest area went through multiple different revisions to ensure we're talking about fuel farms, hangars, fixed base operators, the FBOs, etc. In 1988, the master plan had 6 different alternatives for the airport's configuration with 2 different west side configurations. In 2000, master plan to begin to finalize the layout of the Southwest Development Area with the relocation of Sim Street and the separation of, quote, Old Sim Street and the dedication of the taxiway right away. So there's an image there that shows kind of like what they anticipated would be the light pink areas where they thought a taxiway corridor would come through. And then the darker pink color is where they figured hangar developments would potentially be built. In 2011, the master plan set forth to further define and delineate the boundary of the Southwest Development Area, establishing the Sims Road corridor and what they thought at the time the Southwest Development Area potentially could look like. In this case, you see a number of different hangars. A fuel farm is hidden in there. Kind of hard to see, but it is. I can't really point, but it is there just to the northeast of Southwest Development Area. You can see where they were going to add a brand new fuel farm. So in 2021, in the business strategic plan, they recommended a layout which was a mix of manufacturing, general aviation, and business aviation uses. This is what was in the 2021 strategic business plan. You can see a mix of small aviation hangars, some larger corporate hangars, and maybe some medium-sized corporation hangars. The layout in this area is limited by the VOR. The VOR, you cannot build within the VOR's delineated limits. There has been talk of relocating the VOR, and should that ever happen, this area potentially could expand further. But for now, the area really is limited in scope because of the VOR there. And you can see the VOR's ring, which is the perimeter of where you can and cannot build items. So when we're talking about the Southwest Development Area, I think it's important to talk about what is strategic development. How can we as an airport ensure that we're being fair, not only to the airport users, but to the community about what it is the airport is looking to expand, how it's going to expand, and what it's looking for to expand. We want to try to figure out how to maximize density at the airport and decrease apron space. We want to minimize airport infrastructure costs while maximizing leasehold utility. And we do want to make sure that we have a diversified source of airport operations and revenue. I want to be clear that the strategic goal of the airport is never really to increase operations. We don't control those. And it's not to increase airport revenue. Our goal here is to ensure diverse user base and diverse revenue streams for the airport, not necessarily to make those numbers bigger or higher. In the taxway O, category exclusion, we included a map of what the potential reality looks like for the Southwest development area. I kind of cleaned that up a little bit, and I'm showing to you kind of a layout of the airport. It is illustrative. The lot lines shown are not real. They are illustrative for the purposes of our conversation today. It is about 50 acres in size. The orange areas that you see highlighted on this map are areas that are already allocated for development at the airport, whether that be business aviation hangars, fixed base operators, or manufacturing such as Pilatus. And they're already in the development queue, and they've been previously talked about at other airport advisory board meetings, so we're not going to necessarily talk about those today, but they are underway. Lots 1 and 2, which are relatively new lots for the Southwest development area and defined for our conversation today, are set aside for medium and large business aviation hangars, such as Cessna Citations, Gulfstreams, and that size. We do have some developers who are interested in one or both lots for that kind of size hangar for like a, I guess, condo units would be a good example of the size they're looking at there. Lots 3, 4, and 5 are kind of set aside for medium business aviation hangars, whether that be things like Encores, Mustangs, other corporate smaller jets or VLJs. Lots 6 and 7 are set aside for small to general aviation hangars, which would be an example of Cessna 172s, Piper Seminoles, or et cetera. And we do have a proposal that we've received for the development of sites 6 and 7. Utilizing that entirety of that development. According to the 2023 taxway O category exclusion, there was about 35,000 additional operations they expected the Southwest development area to have, which would increase the 65 DNL surface area by about 8.2% as a worst case scenario based on quite frequent aviation use. And the goal here is to avoid significantly increasing operations and certainly to decrease the propensity to have sustained traffic pattern operations by use.
What's DNL?
DNL is the day-night level average of noise that the airport would have. The latest DNL map we have for 65 DNL was part of the 2011 master plan they put on the map. Most of the easements for the airport rely on the 1988 master plan for the noise contours.
Okay, thank you.
But it is important to talk about in the sense that the goal for the Southwest development side is to find ways that do not significantly increase traffic pattern operations and that they focus on in and out operations or site maintenance operations where they come in and they don't have to leave right away. It's important when we talk about the airport development, we do have a proposal for lots 6 and 7 from a developer who's interested in doing that today. We have potential interest in lots 2 as well, 1 and 2, and they are consistent with the airport's master plan and the airport's strategic plan. And all of these are tentatively allocated. We do not necessarily know if they're the highest best use for that land. And so we kind of have to figure out how to zone the airport in a way that ensures an orderly development and that it's a transparent process. So today, what we're kind of talking about is whether or not it's appropriate to accept the proposals that we received for lots 6 and 7 or lots 1 and 2, or if it's necessary for us to do an RFP process or a public request for proposals process rather than just blanketly accepting the proposals that we've received. The goal here is to be transparent about what the development of the airport is happening, to allow there to be the opportunity to see what is happening and to score those proposals in a way, in a matrix that makes sense. It's difficult to do that when we have received proposals, unsolicited proposals for development. So what's before you today is not necessarily development that the airport's bringing to you. We're doing this in response to proposals we've already received for these spots. It's my opinion, I guess it's the airport, that it's not proper to necessarily accept the LOIs or the proposals that we've received, but to ensure that the process is done through an RFP process that we can properly score and evaluate. The only way to develop the airport in an orderly way, in my opinion, is to do that through the RFP. And I was going to kind of talk to you about it and see if you had an opinion about whether or not an RFP process made sense through this process to kind of evaluate each lot individually and try to seek the best use for that property, or if it was more appropriate to just accept the proposals we've had and received. Does the body have any opinion on that issue? Go ahead.
I most definitely agree with the RFP process. I have a side question. What, has the county expressed an interest in some of those plots themselves? In other words, as a, not really as a customer, but as a primary user.
I would say that the airport's prerogative is to not own anything. So if there's private developers that would like to build hangars on the airport, the private market is the best known entity that can control or know what the market is. I would not suggest or think that the airport would be in the position to build hangars on their own.
Would the RFP process scour the current proposals?
The current proposals I know for lots 6 and 7 would like to proceed forward as fast as they possibly can on those. They certainly had expressed interest to come to show you what that proposals look like. My direction to them was to not do that because I did not want their intellectual property to be presented to the general public if an RFP process was going to go forward. So we do have interest. They do want to follow the process. If an RFP is what we decide to do, or that's what we're recommending that we do, they would proceed in that process. And they potentially could be selected, but it is important, I think, for me to ensure that we're being fair and transparent about the process.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. We need to do an RFP process and that's could very well drive some costs down as well, make it a little more competitive. So, but absolutely need a transparent process. Yeah.
What's the cost and timeline of the RFP process?
I think I will let Ben, we did this once before where we did an RFP for land just south of the southern parallel. And I think, Ben, do you have particular details about how that process went in the past?
It's run like any other kind of purchasing or solicitation through the county, so we would need to develop both kind of solicitation package with purchasing as well as a draft contract to be included in there that potential winners would get to review and potentially make comments on. So that takes some time. But I think if we chose to go this route, my hope would be we could have something out on the street within a couple months, knowing how long it typically takes. Typically you give a month or two for responses, maybe 2 in this case, because there's some due diligence that needs to happen. But yeah, hopefully we could have a selection done spring of next year, potentially. Just thinking off the top of my head.
I will clarify. There's no taxiway yet, so it's not like we're in a hurry to do this because they can't get anywhere. So it's a matter of taxiway comes first, development comes later. We're kind of jumping ahead here because we do have developers who kind of come to us and said they want to develop. So we do need to have an accurate response. That response is either accept proposals or do RFP, and my recommendation would be to do the RFP.
So the point I want to bring up, I think that one of the most basic questions that we'd have to do if we're going to do that is, it's either does the airport sell land to the private sector to do their thing and, you know, get the revenue from selling land, or do ground lease the land? I think that's a big question that has to be answered first. Or do you do an RFP that says, make a proposal for whichever you prefer? Or is it better off to guide the RFP process by having some intentionality behind, look, we're only interested in doing this as a ground lease, so that prospective developers can say, here's our proposal for a ground lease. You'd hate to have somebody who is a prospective developer there who says, gosh, if we had only known you preferred a ground lease, we would have made a proposal around that versus that. And I think that's a you know, kind of a
And
binary
I-
question that the airport ought to
And
answer.
everybody's
Or at least
mandated to
talk
go
about.
out.
It will never
Is
be
it?
sold,
It'll
so
never be-
it will never be sold, and there's a couple catches here too. One, the land at the airport will never be sold, I shouldn't say that, we did sell land, so let's clarify.
Right, that's been on the.
On the east side of Sims, coming up to the airport, all that land will stay aeronautical for the foreseeable future. We already divested and sold or are allocating to sell land that we can west of Sims,
On their side.
non-air side. So if it's aeronautical property, it won't ever be sold. The FAA would never let it be sold.
Okay.
So
So it's all ground
it
lease.
will all be ground
All be
lease.
ground lease,
And
okay.
the way that would work, there'd be some conversation about how the ground rent would work. Typically, market rate would be whatever ground rent is. So if we get a set of proposals for different lots, ultimately what would happen is we would look at proposals based on merits and not revenue.
Right.
The revenue would be kind of like neutral across the board. It's all kind of gonna be the same. The thing that normally catches people by surprise is reversion. And so when we're talking about airport development, 50 years from now, when we're all gone and we're not really concerned about leases at the airport anymore, everything comes back. So at year 50, when the lease is over, assuming it hasn't been extended, that property comes back to the airport, well, not property. The improvements come back to the airport, the hangars come back to the airport, all that stuff comes back. And either the airport redevelops it again, or it sells off those assets, or it manages them. Like, it's similar to kind of other airport or hangars the airport owns. We kind of got it through some reversionary process or closure process, and now the airport owns that. So it won't be sold. The revenue itself is kind of neutral across the board, best use, highest use.
Okay.
And then it's 50 years from the timeline from whenever, it all comes
Yeah,
back.
okay. I know we had talked previously about, you know, what was most advantageous for the airport to, you know, generate funds to operate with by sales. And I think we use that, although I may be wrong about that. But I was thinking more along the lines of kind of guiding what that development would be, at least giving developers a fair shot at, you know, what they.
Certainly, and
they-
as-
Them and us, so.
And as we figure out kind of like what the layouts really look like, because like once I said, the map is kind of illustrative. And so as the proposals come in and we've kind of figured out how to iron those things into best use cases, there will be chunks left over that could potentially be non-aeronautical. So like when you're thinking about the airport does have land we own that we do lease for non-aeronautical purposes. So like Wendy's and 7-Eleven on Wadsworth, that's actually on airport property and they pay the airport rent to be there. So it can be a mix, and we kind of figure those things out as we kind of iron what those really look like.
So my thoughts, it sounds like everyone's in agreement, there needs to be some kind of process. In the state of Colorado, because I've been on the side of, both sides of it, there's RFPs, there's RFIs, and there's RFQs. And just make sure that you have gone through each and structure the process to what is most beneficial, because we know some of the limitations. Like you said, revenue is going to be equal. Give yourself the leeway and the liberty, because each of the three processes is there for a reason. And gives you a different structure of how you can shape those outcomes.
Sure.
And I'm not the lawyer that can go deeper, but I know I've done all three and they're all three a little bit different. So RFIs, RFQs, and RFPs.
Question. Because of urgency, if the RFP proposal included constructing all or part of the taxiway, could that be accepted?
So I know based on some of the conversations we've had with developers, that we would not necessarily expect there to be a phase 2 of taxiway O or K. Because like it was designed originally to be 2 phases, a phase 1 that went 1,800 feet from taxiway Delta, and then a phase 2 that would come later that bring us pretty much all the way to Sims. It's probably not likely that it will be necessary for the airport to use federal funds or local funds to build that extension. It's potentially possible, based on the proposals that we get, that private developer would continue that extension on as part of their development. I'm not saying that's for certain. The way I've laid this out currently presumes that there would be a phase 2 and other airport-owned infrastructure within it to kind of ensure that there's navigable ways and it's not being blocked by different developers. But it's possible that there could be ways in order which taxiway K could just end where we build it to, and then the rest is privately built. It's unknown at the moment. Okay, I think I have everything I need for that unless there's other comments.
No, I think the only comment I had, thanks, Jensen. I guess maybe you don't know this, or maybe you do, which process do you think would be the best way to ensure, I guess, maximum usage of airport resources? And in my mind, I see there's a lot of demand for the airport right now. There's waiting lists for hangars, there's business jets and other things. How do we maximize the use of the land, the limited land that we have? Is that through an RFP process, or is the LOI kind of indicative of our master plan, it looks like, but maybe the RFP would be better? I guess which direction kind of would,
I think there's a danger necessarily in accepting LOIs ad hoc. It doesn't let us control and ensure that we're doing development in an orderly way that kind of respects what airport development kind of has to look like, to ensure that we're not growing in ways that are not conducive to ensuring compatibility with land use. And so we're going to want to make sure that we have pretty good control of what that ultimate use looks like. It probably would not be beneficial to just leave it completely open and say, whatever you want to build, just build it. So there will be, restrictions per lot as to what that lot kind of looks like. Ideally, lot 1 and 2 could be manufacturing or large business, corporate aviation. And then as you get further back into the nested network, the hangars would kind of become smaller. And that makes sense. So whatever process Ben kind of ultimately decides makes sense, Ben gets to do it because it's kind of his bailiwick. So I'll let him have the expert opinion on what he thinks process really makes sense. But I just want to make sure that we're on board as to the quote unquote RFP process makes sense as a way to orderly develop it rather than just kind of accepting whatever comes.
Seems like anything less than that would be too scattershot and could end up with a real mass centric.
Historically, the airport has done mostly accepting proposals as they've come along. The recent RFP that we did not necessarily result in a lease. And so we did do the RFP, and then ultimately it resulted in kind of accepting a proposal. So if nothing else, the RFP broadcasts our intentions to respond to the requests that we've had for development and what we think is appropriate versus what's not.
So the reality in development, you do an RFP or an RFI or an RFQ, there is a large contingency that we're putting in time and effort into that process. So, the one thing in negotiating separate is that you've got a larger pool, you're automatically cutting your pool down because of the resources that go into responding at one of these, especially at such a public level. Doesn't make it not the right process. That's typically the reality of it.
But you probably get more serious and viable proposals.
You certainly would get people that would be willing to accept the attention that would come with it. And I think that's an appropriate measure, is that developer has to be able to carry the water of their development. It can't be the airport saying, hey, let's go do this thing. It really is up to the developer to push and say, we want this because of X, Y, Z, and here we are to present it. I think that's important.
Any last comments on this one?
Just kind of make one real quick. It's probably, I heard you several times that when you were delineating the different lots, but it's kind of quasi fantasy, right? Because you just don't know what's going to be.
Yeah, illustrative.
Illustrated, that was the word. My thought was, we're kind of excluding that radius around the VOR, and I know the FAA is looking at decommissioning a good number of VORs. So is that something, I know way out in the future that maybe that's an opportunity as well, that VOR may be decommissioned?
So one of the reasons so the entire southwest site is about 100 acres. And that includes the VOR and things like that. And then one of the reasons we're at 50 is because we stay outside the VOR.
Mhm.
And also we have to kind of set aside public infrastructure so that we get through developments, and that's not charged. And so when we're looking at the layout of the site, we have to think about it as like highway and roads.
Okay.
And that kind of gives you the example. You can see the black one is taxiway K,
Mhm.
and then everything that's gray as a taxiway is potential future airport-owned taxi lane. And so we're looking at development building outside of public infrastructure. And so that's kind of how the 100 acres kind of keeps decreasing in size, because you can't develop where the airport needs to ensure public navigational taxiways. For the VOR, one of the reasons it's important that we set aside kind of different routes through the structure is that if and or when the VOR gets decommissioned, which who knows when, this is a pretty important VOR for the FAA. And so if and or when it went away, the reason that we have public infrastructure going through the development is so that if and or the future, there's a need to develop there, we can do that. That'd be pretty deep. You'd be looking at something pretty significant in the sense of like manufacturing. You're probably not gonna build small T's or something way deep out that way. So use is gonna be something to talk about if then, when that happens. For now, I'm not planning on the VOR being decommissioned anytime soon, so it makes sense to lay out the site in a way that acknowledges the VOR's propensity to exist for the foreseeable future.
All right, we're at 6:05, but I think we've got a few project updates we want to get through.
I think it would be important. I mean, there was comments about unleaded fuel and it is a frustrating topic for us too. And so I know, Ben will talk about it, maybe a little bit more in depth than he planned on talking about it, but, we'll talk about it and we'll get through everything else as well. Ben?
All right, same updates as previous months. Some things have changed, some are hopefully about to change. In terms of taxiway Kilo Delta, as we know, the FAA grant agreement's been signed and also the construction contract has been signed. We're still in the thick of working on utility coordination and designing the turnarounds. That will be on either side of the taxiway on what's called Old Sim Street on the west and what will be called Calendar Drive on the east. We also are working on a separate locally funded project to design a fence that will go contain the airport land inside of it. So that one will also happen kind of at the same time, but funded by the airport because it's not eligible for federal funds. So two key things we're waiting on at the moment is a safety risk management panel with the FAA. This is kind of a newer requirement that we discussed with ATC and a bunch of other airport stakeholders. Anytime a project potentially impacts the airspace. So they bring in like a facilitator and they make sure they brainstorm out any potential impacts and how we might address them. And then the other thing we're waiting on is final U.S. Army Corps of Engineering determination on that there are no federal waters through the project area. So that's a commitment we made as part of the environmental review for this project, and we expect that determination here shortly. Basing 160, this one is same kind of same status. The grant has been signed and executed, contract as well, and we're just waiting on that safety risk management panel with the FAA to get started on this. It's another one that's where we're slightly frustrated on. We could perhaps shoulder some of the blame of knowing to schedule this safety risk management panel, but it was a surprise to us, and so we're waiting on the FAA to schedule that so that we can get started on construction. I guess there's a shortage of facilitators who do this nationally, so we're waiting on a date to have that one. Unleaded fuel. So as Eric mentioned, we've all been wanting to get working on unleaded fuel. I think the airport's position early in 2024 was we were hoping that a tank on this airfield would be able to be reused by the airport for unleaded fuel, and that turned out to not be practical in the end in terms of taking it over from an existing leasehold and transitioning it. So then we swapped to the approach of going for a federal grant to install a completely new tank in the bulk fuel facility. So we worked up a RFQ for that. The one thing that's different from this, from other projects we do, is that this project wasn't contemplated in our on-call engineering contract with our engineering firm back when we engaged with them in 2023-ish. So we have to go out again for a separate design solicitation. And so that's one thing that's taking longer is we have to in order to receive federal funds, we have to go out and solicit a design firm who will look at the bulk fuel facility, determine if there's room for one, what containment needs to be done, and also spec the actual installation of the tank. So we expect that solicitation to go out, I'm hoping within the week, but certainly this month. We select that design firm, they design it, hopefully we're out to bid in early to mid 2025 with the actual construction occurring in mid 2025 is my goal at the moment. So yes, it's taken longer than we wanted. It's been a learning curve for purchasing and at Jeffco and attorney's office and us in terms of running this process without having our on-call engineer do some of the documents, but we're moving along. Same thing, Part 150 airport noise compatibility study. The federal grant has been signed. We have a signed contract with RSNH, who's the consultant helping us do this. fact, we had our first kickoff meeting with them to kind of start fleshing out a schedule for that, earlier this week. Or earlier last week. So just a reminder, it contains two phases, the development of noise exposure maps and then the development of a noise compatibility plan, assuming that there's an incompatible land use determined or identified as part of those noise exposure maps. So current work on that, we have that internal kickoff meeting. We're developing a project management plan. Kind of the big one we're working through, or that I'm excited about, is public engagement part of this, which probably will have a larger kickoff component to it with a big open house. I would think in early springtime 2025. Right now, they actually have to take in a bunch of data that we'll be giving them, that we actually have to reach out to other local communities to get in terms of land use. So more to come on that one.
Any
And that's it.
board questions on those projects? All right, we're to the end of the meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Second.
I'll second that.
All right, all in favor? No one's opposed. All right, we are adjourned at 6:10. Thank you all.
Hey, Greg.